You can't do this. This is my community. I built this. Her voice echoed off the cheap paneling of the community clubhouse, a shrill, cracking shriek that vibrated with pure, undiluted rage. It was the sound of a queen watching her castle turn to sand. I just stood there, hands loosely in my pockets, watching the spectacle unfold. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. Just a quiet, clinical satisfaction, like a structural engineer watching a controlled demolition go exactly according to plan. What would you do if your quiet life was turned upside down by a petty tyrant? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My story starts not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a key in a lock. I had moved into the house in Willow Creek Estates seeking silence. After my wife, Eleanor, passed away, our big city home felt cavernous, each room a museum of a life we were supposed to live together. This house, her parents' old place, was smaller, nestled in a subdivision that prided itself on its tranquility and perfectly manicured lawns. It was supposed to be a soft landing, a place to heal. I'm a structural engineer by trade, a man who deals in load-bearing walls and stress tolerances. I prefer predictable, solid things. I thought Willow Creek would be just that. I was wrong. The subdivision had a fissure running right through its foundation, and her name was Brenda. I suppose I should have seen the signs. The welcome basket that arrived on my second day contained a bottle of cheap Chardonnay, some stale crackers, and a 3-ring binder thicker than any building code manual I'd ever seen. It was the Homeowners Association covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Brenda, the HOA president, delivered it herself. She was a woman who seemed permanently braced for a confrontation, with sharp, bird-like features and hair sprayed into a helmet of improbable rigidity. She didn't smile, she just showed her teeth. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she'd said, her eyes doing a rapid, critical scan of my front porch. "We have high standards here. You'll find everything you need to know in the binder." It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. For the first few months, I kept my head down. I followed the rules. I cut my grass to the prescribed 2.5 inches. I put my trash cans away precisely at 6:01 p.m. on collection day. I was grieving, and I didn't have the energy for conflict. I spent my evenings in Eleanor's old rose garden, a small patch of defiant color she'd planted years ago for her mother. It was the only part of the house that still felt alive, that still felt like her. The inciting incident, when it came, was as mundane as it was absurd. It arrived via an email with a subject line in all caps, Community Beautification Project Announcement. The email, penned by Brenda, announced the construction of a grand new entrance sign for Willow Creek Estates. It would be a monument of brick and wrought iron, a testament to the prestige and exclusivity of our little slice of suburbia. The location was described vaguely as, at the main entrance corner on Willow Creek Drive. That corner was my corner. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured they'd build it on the common area, a strip of grass the HOA maintained on the other side of the sidewalk. A week later, a crew of workmen showed up. They drove stakes into the ground not on the common area, but on my side of the sidewalk. Right on the edge of my lawn. I went outside, holding a cup of coffee, and approached the foreman. "Morning," I said. "Just curious, you guys sure this is the right spot?" "This is my property." The foreman, a burly man with a sunburned neck, shrugged. "Got a work order from the HOA. This is where the blueprint says it goes." I'm a patient man. I believe in polite discourse. I called the number for the HOA management company and left a message. Then I sent a polite email to the HOA board, care of Brenda. I explained that the planned location for the sign appeared to be on my property, specifically on a utility and access easement. I attached a digital copy of my property survey from when we'd settled Eleanor's parents' estate. The response I got was not a phone call, but a sharp rap on my door an hour later. It was Brenda, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like nervous hostages. "Mr. Henderson," she began, skipping any pleasantries. "I received your little email. We have a problem." "I agree," I said calmly. "Your construction crew is about to pour a concrete foundation on my land." She let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a startled crow. "Your land? Don't be ridiculous. That strip of grass belongs to the community. It's for the beautification of Willow Creek, something you clearly don't appreciate. Her gaze flickered to my porch, where a single pot of geraniums had a few withered leaves. I held my ground. Brenda, I have the county plat map and a certified survey. The property line extends 10 feet from the curb. The first 5 feet are a utility easement, but it's still my deeded property. You are trespassing. This was a mistake. Using facts with Brenda was like using a water pistol on a grease fire. It only made things worse. Don't you dare quote legal nonsense at me, she snapped, her voice rising. I have been president of this HOA for 8 years. I know every inch of this neighborhood. That land is ours, and we will build our sign there. You are interfering with an official HOA project. It's not interference to protect my own property, I said, my patience starting to fray. You'll be hearing from us, she said, turning on her heel. It was a promise. The next day, the workers were back. They started digging. And in my mailbox, I found the first official notice. It was a fine. $100. The violation. Interference with an approved HOA community project. It was utterly insane. She was fining me for questioning her right to build on my own land. It was at that moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person. I was dealing with a tyrant. The foundation of my quiet life had just cracked, and I knew if I didn't do something, the whole structure was going to come down. The sign went up quickly. It was as garish as I'd imagined, a monstrosity of cheap brick veneer and faux wrought iron that looked like something from a low-budget fantasy movie. It sat there on my easement, a 10-ton monument to Brenda's ego. And the fines kept coming. I refused to pay the first one, of course. I sent a certified letter back to the board, again reiterating the legal position and stating that any fines related to this issue were invalid. Brenda's response was to escalate. It was like she was testing my structural integrity, applying more and more pressure to see where I would break. A letter arrived about my lawn. The grass, it seemed, was 1/4 of an inch too high in one particular patch near the driveway. The photo she included was so blurry it could have been a picture of Bigfoot. Fine, $50. Another letter. My mailbox, a standard black model that had been there for 15 years, was suddenly not in compliance with the newly updated community aesthetic guidelines. Fine, $75. She started a campaign of public shaming. In the monthly Willow Creek newsletter, in a section titled, Community Compliance Corner, she wrote a thinly veiled article about uncooperative residents who lack community spirit and stand in the way of progress. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Some neighbors started avoiding my gaze when I walked to the mailbox. I was being painted as the villain, the troublemaker who hated nice signs. The harassment was constant, a low-grade buzzing of static in the air. I documented everything. Every letter, every email, every passive-aggressive newsletter article. I created a file, labeling it simply HOA. It grew thicker by the week. I was still operating under the assumption that logic and reason would eventually prevail. I thought if I just built a strong enough case, the other board members, or the community itself, would see the absurdity of it all. But Brenda had them all cowed. She ruled through fear and intimidation. Anyone who had ever challenged her had been subjected to the same treatment, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, until they either gave in or moved out. I was just the latest nail that needed to be hammered down. I tried talking to other board members individually. One of them, a timid man named Arthur, actually looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, Frank," he mumbled, looking at his shoes. "It's just. Brenda gets her way. It's easier not to fight it." Easier. That was the word that defined the whole community's response. It was easier to let the bully win. The pressure mounted, but I refused to buckle. I was an engineer. I understood stress and strain. I knew that every material has a breaking point. I just didn't realize she would target mine so precisely, so cruelly. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning. I found another envelope stuck to my front door. Inside was not just a fine, but a notice of remediation. My heart went cold as I read it. The notice cited a new rule, apparently passed in an emergency session the night before, regarding non-native and unapproved flora. It specifically mentioned my late wife's rose garden. The garden was my sanctuary. Eleanor had planted those bushes with her own hands, tending to them with a love and care that I was now trying to emulate. They were a living connection to her, a splash of vibrant life against the gray canvas of my grief. According to Brenda's new rule, these specific cultivars of roses were now a violation. The notice gave me 48 hours to remove them completely. If I failed to comply, the HOA would hire a landscaping crew to remediate the violation and bill me for the costs, along with a hefty noncompliance penalty. I stood there on my porch, the flimsy piece of paper trembling in my hand. This wasn't about a sign anymore. It wasn't about grass height or mailboxes. This was a deliberate, malicious attack on the one thing I had left of her. She was trying to bulldoze my wife's memory. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, cold, and calculated fracture. The peace-seeking man who had moved to Willow Creek was gone. In his place stood a structural engineer who had just watched a petty tyrant place a demolition charge on the most important load-bearing wall of his life. She had pushed too far. She had mistaken my patience for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My desire for a quiet life was replaced by a new, singular focus. I was going to dismantle Brenda's little empire, brick by brick. And I was going to use her own rulebook to do it. That afternoon, I didn't hire a lawyer. Not yet. Lawyers are expensive, and I had a very particular set of skills. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but now it was overlaid with a cold, clear anger. It was fuel. My first stop was the county records office. I spent hours poring over the original plat maps for the entire Willow Creek subdivision, not just my lot. I downloaded every deed, every covenant, every amendment filed since the developer first broke ground 30 years ago. I printed them all, creating my own binder, one that would soon rival Brenda's. Next, I hired a surveyor, the best in the county. I didn't just want him to restake my property line. I wanted an updated, ironclad, unimpeachable survey of my entire lot, with specific topographical data on the easement where the sign stood. I wanted it documented to the millimeter. When he was done, I had a report that was as solid as concrete. Then, I turned my attention to the HOA itself. I formally requested, as was my right as a homeowner, a complete record of the HOA's financials for the past 5 years. I also requested the minutes from every board meeting, including the emergency session where they had outlawed my wife's roses. Brenda, of course, stonewalled. She sent back a curt email stating that the financial records were confidential and the minutes would be available after formal approval, a process that could take months. She was wrong. State law mandated that these records be available to homeowners. Her refusal was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against her. While I waited for the official channels to work, I started my own on-the-ground investigation. I installed several small, high-definition security cameras around my property. They were discreet, nestled in trees and under the eaves of the house. One had a perfect, clear view of the new sign. Another covered my driveway and front porch. A third was aimed directly at the rose garden. I was no longer just defending, I was setting a trap. My investigation into the public records yielded its first major discovery. As I traced the chain of ownership for all the common areas, I found a glaring anomaly. The main park and picnic area, which Brenda ruled over like her personal fiefdom, had never been properly deeded to the HOA. The title was still held by Willow Creek Developers, LLC, a corporation that had been dissolved in 1998. Legally, the HOA was trespassing on land owned by a defunct company. Brenda had been spending HOA funds for years maintaining and improving property the association didn't even own. This was more than just incompetence. This was negligence on a grand scale. But the real bombshell was hidden in the budget documents I finally pried from the management company after threatening them with a formal complaint to the State Real Estate Board. The cost for the new sign was listed at $50,000. I knew construction costs. I knew materials. I could look at that sign and tell you, down to the last brick and screw, what it should have cost. $30,000 would have been high. $25,000 was more realistic. A $50,000 price tag was criminally inflated. I started digging into the contractor who built it. Prestige Monument Solutions, the company was called. A quick search of state business records revealed it was a new company, incorporated only 6 months before the sign project was announced. The registered agent and sole officer was a man named Martin Petrov. The address listed for the business was a residential home in the next town over. A little more digging, a cross-reference of public property records, and I found it. The linchpin. The critical point of failure in Brenda's corrupt structure. The owner of that residential home was Martin Petrov. And his wife? Brenda Petrov. She hadn't just inflated the cost. She had awarded a no-bid, $50,000 contract to her own husband. She was using our HOA dues to line her own pockets. I leaned back in my chair, the document spread across my dining room table. This was it. This was the weakness I was looking for. She wasn't just a bully, she was a crook. And now I had the proof. The fight over the roses had led me to a crime. My quiet war had just escalated, and I had the ammunition to win it. My grief for Eleanor had been a fog, but this was a blueprint. I saw the path forward with perfect clarity. Brenda thought she was building a monument to her power. I was about to prove that she had actually just built her own tombstone, and she'd put it on my property. With the evidence of fraud in hand, my plan began to crystallize. It wouldn't be enough to just expose her. That would be messy, and it would still leave her with supporters claiming it was all a misunderstanding. No, the takedown had to be systematic, undeniable, and public. It had to be a controlled demolition, where the structure collapses in on itself, leaving no doubt as to the outcome. I started to think of it as Project Nightingale, a nod to Eleanor's favorite bird and the roses Brenda had threatened. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, the legal foundation. Phase 2, the public cracks. Phase 3, the controlled collapse. Phase 1 began with a series of certified letters. The first was to the HOA board. It was a formal notice of trespass regarding the sign. I cited the new survey, attached a copy, and gave them 30 days to remove the structure from my easement. I also included a bill for the survey's cost and a modest fee for the unauthorized use of my land, calculated daily. I knew they would ignore it. This wasn't about getting them to move the sign, it was about creating a documented paper trail of their willful negligence. The second letter was a formal demand, again citing state law, for the unapproved minutes of the emergency meeting and the full, unredacted financials. I gave them a 10-day deadline before I would file a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. This was designed to apply pressure and force them into making a mistake. While I waited for the deadlines to expire, I began setting the physical trap. The 48-hour deadline for the removal of the roses was fast approaching. On the evening of the first day, I made a very conspicuous show of working in the garden. I trimmed, I pruned, I watered. I wanted to make it clear that I had no intention of complying. I knew Brenda patrolled the neighborhood in her white SUV every evening. I made sure she saw me. The trap was my camera system. I checked the angles, cleaned the lenses, and ensured the night vision was working perfectly. I had a strong suspicion that Brenda was not the type to wait for the official landscapers. Her ego would demand a more personal touch. I also reached out to a few people. The first was George, a retired accountant who lived down the street. He was a quiet man who had once tried to ask a pointed question about the budget at an annual meeting and had been brutally shut down by Brenda. I invited him over for a coffee, laid out the inflated invoice for the sign and the incorporation documents for her husband's company. George's eyes, normally placid, narrowed to sharp points. He spent 10 minutes looking over the papers without a word. Finally, he looked up at me. I knew it, he whispered. I knew something was wrong with the books. Frank, this is grand larceny. He became my first and most crucial ally. The 48-hour deadline for the roses passed. Nothing happened on the 3rd day, or the 4th. I knew she was waiting, trying to make me sweat. The official fine for noncompliance arrived in the mail. I filed it away in my binder. Then, on the 5th night, my trap sprang. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from one of the cameras. I watched the live feed from my bed. A dark figure was creeping across my lawn. A moment later, a second figure joined. They were dressed in dark hoodies, but as they moved under a motion-activated security light, I saw them clearly. It was Brenda and her husband, Martin. Martin was carrying a large canister of what looked like herbicide. Brenda was holding a can of spray paint. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a cold, thrilling certainty. This was it. This was the mistake I was waiting for. I watched, my phone recording every second, as Martin began methodically spraying the base of each of Eleanor's rose bushes. He soaked them, ensuring the poison would be fatal. Then Brenda stepped forward. She shook the can of spray paint and, in big, crude letters, scrawled "Rule Breaker" on my driveway. They stood back for a moment, admiring their handiwork like a pair of degenerate artists. Then they scurried off into the darkness. I didn't call the police. Not yet. A police report would be a single event. A high-definition video, saved and backed up in multiple locations, was a weapon. I now had undeniable proof of vandalism and destruction of property, committed personally by the HOA president and her husband, the fraudulent contractor. Phase 1 was complete. I had my legal foundation, and it was rock solid. Now it was time to start showing the cracks to the rest of the community. The next monthly HOA meeting was a week away. I emailed the management company and formally requested to be added to the agenda under New Business. The topic, I wrote, was Community Assets and Legal Liabilities. It sounded boring and official, which was exactly the point. Brenda wouldn't be able to refuse it without looking like she was hiding something. The morning of the meeting, I discovered the roses were already wilting, their leaves curling and turning black. The sight sent a fresh pang of grief and anger through me. But I pushed it down. Emotion was a liability now. I needed to be cold, precise, and methodical. I took high-resolution photos of the dead roses and the spray-painted driveway. More evidence for the file. That evening, the community clubhouse was about half full. The usual group of Brenda's loyalists sat in the front, while the rest of the residents were scattered in the back, looking bored. Brenda ran the meeting with her usual iron fist, rushing through the agenda items. And finally, she said, with a dismissive sigh, "We have Mr. Henderson, who wants to discuss assets and liabilities." She said the words as if they were a bad taste in her mouth. I walked to the front of the room. I hadn't brought a projector or a presentation. Just a single manila folder. I wanted this first reveal to be quiet and personal, a tremor before the earthquake. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and even. I scanned the room, making eye contact with a few people. "I'll be brief. I'm here tonight because I have some concerns about the HOA's potential legal exposure. Specifically, regarding the new entrance sign." Brenda interrupted immediately. "That has been discussed and settled. The sign is a beautiful addition to our community. We are not reopening that topic." "I'm afraid we have to," I said, not looking at her, but at the other board members. "Because as it stands, the HOA is currently trespassing." I opened the folder and took out the certified survey. I laid it on the table in front of the board. "This is a survey of my property, completed 2 weeks ago. As you can clearly see, the sign, its concrete foundation, and the surrounding landscaping are all located on my private property, within a utility easement." I then produced a copy of the certified letter. "This is a copy of the legal notice I sent to the board 32 days ago, informing you of the trespass. I have received no official response." A murmur went through the room. People were starting to sit up and pay attention. "My question for the board is this," I continued, my voice level. "Why did you knowingly authorize the construction of a $50,000 structure on private property without the owner's consent? And are you aware that you are now exposing every member of this HOA to a potentially very expensive lawsuit?" The silence was deafening. I had framed it not as my problem, but as their problem. Their money was on the line. Brenda's face had gone from smug to a blotchy, furious red. She shot to her feet. "This is outrageous. This is a lie. That survey is a fake," she shrieked. "He's just angry because he was fined for his numerous violations. He is an enemy of this community." She was losing control. Her reaction was so over the top, so hysterical compared to my calm, factual presentation, that it had the opposite of its intended effect. People weren't looking at me with suspicion, they were looking at her with unease. The timid board member, Arthur, picked up the survey and stared at it, his face pale. "He is trying to sabotage Willow Creek," Brenda yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He should be sanctioned. He should be expelled." I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. I had planted the first seed of doubt. I had shown the first crack in the foundation. I calmly collected my papers and walked back to my seat. The rest of the meeting was chaos, but I had accomplished my goal. Brenda's credibility was bleeding out on the clubhouse floor, and she was the one holding the knife. Phase 2 was now in motion. The public cracks were beginning to show. Brenda's reaction was exactly what I had predicted. A cornered animal doesn't reason, it lashes out. The public questioning of her authority had sent her into a fury, and she retaliated with a ferocity that bordered on the psychotic. The petty fines and newsletter shaming were child's play compared to what came next. 2 days after the meeting, a police car pulled into my driveway. 2 officers came to my door, looking grim. They informed me that a complaint had been filed against me for harassment by none other than Brenda Petrov. She claimed I was stalking her, following her on her neighborhood patrols, and making threatening gestures. I calmly invited them in and offered them coffee. I showed them the video footage from my security cameras for the past week, which clearly showed me either inside my house or working in my yard. It also showed Brenda's SUV driving past my house no less than 17 times in a single day. "Gentlemen," I said, pausing the video where her car slowed to a crawl in front of my house. "Who exactly is stalking whom?" The officers exchanged a look. They knew the type. Every cop has dealt with a neighborhood tyrant who uses the police as their personal army. They took my statement, reviewed the footage, and left. The complaint was dismissed as unfounded, but the incident was chilling. She was willing to file a false police report, a serious crime, just to intimidate me. This was another piece of evidence for my file. Next, she turned to social media. On the official Willow Creek Estates community Facebook page, a series of anonymous posts began to appear. They painted me as a dangerous recluse and a potential threat to our children. The posts hinted at a dark past, suggesting I had been forced to move here under mysterious circumstances. It was a vile, cowardly smear campaign. I knew it was Brenda, or one of her cronies acting on her orders. The language had her signature brand of self-righteous venom. I didn't engage. I just took screenshots of every post, every comment. It was libel, plain and simple. More fuel for the fire. The final escalation was the most vicious. She tried to get me fired. She somehow found out where I worked, my engineering firm, and sent a long, rambling letter to the managing partners. She accused me of being mentally unstable, of having a criminal history, which was a complete fabrication, and of using company resources to wage a war against my community. She demanded that they take action against me before my unhinged behavior reflected poorly on the firm. My boss, a straight-shooting man named David, called me into his office. He had the letter on his desk. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, I thought her campaign might actually work. "Frank," he said, sliding the letter across the desk. "I just got off the phone with our lawyers. What the hell is going on?" I spent the next hour laying out the entire story, from the sign to the embezzlement to the dead roses. I didn't have my binder of evidence with me, but I didn't need it. The truth has a certain resonance, a structural integrity that lies can't replicate. When I was finished, David leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. "Good Lord. This woman is a piece of work." He picked up the letter. "Our lawyers seem to think this constitutes tortious interference and defamation. They're actually quite excited." He looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "So, what are you going to do?" "I have a plan," I said. "Good," he replied, tearing Brenda's letter in half and dropping it into the trash. "Let me know if you need anything. The firm stands behind you." I walked out of his office feeling a profound sense of relief. Her most vicious attack had failed completely. In fact, it had backfired, giving me another potential legal weapon and the full support of my employer. She was digging her own grave deeper with every shovel of dirt she threw at me. While Brenda was busy with her campaign of terror, my ally George was making a breakthrough. He had been quietly talking to a woman who used to be on the HOA board with Brenda. The woman had quit a year ago, citing personal reasons. George suspected there was more to it. After some gentle prodding, the woman, named Carol, finally opened up. She had quit because she had discovered Brenda's financial shenanigans. She had confronted Brenda about awarding the landscaping contract, a precursor to the signed contract, to a company she suspected was linked to her husband. Brenda had threatened her, promising to make her life a living hell, to ruin her reputation in the community. Carol, recently widowed and emotionally fragile, had backed down and resigned in silence. But now, seeing that someone was finally standing up to Brenda, she found her courage. She had saved copies of the emails from her confrontation with Brenda. In one of them, Brenda had accidentally, or arrogantly, admitted it. "Martin's company does good work and gives us a fair price," Brenda had written. "It's perfectly legal and it's none of your business. Drop it, or you'll regret it." This was the smoking gun. A direct, written admission that she was awarding contracts to her husband's company, combined with a threat against another board member. It was the final, undeniable proof of corruption and malfeasance. Carol agreed to sign an affidavit and provide the emails. She would be our whistleblower. I now had everything I needed. Evidence of trespassing, property destruction, vandalism, filing a false police report, libel, and now, thanks to Carol and George, concrete proof of felony embezzlement and witness intimidation. The time for quiet planning was over. It was time to involve higher authorities. I took a day off from work. I organized my binder, tabbing each section with colored flags: trespass, vandalism, financials, libel, threats. I created a digital copy on a flash drive, including the video files and the scanned emails from Carol. It was a comprehensive, undeniable case file detailing the systematic corruption and criminal activity of the Willow Creek Estates HOA president. My first stop was not the local police, but the district attorney's office. I had an appointment with an investigator in the white-collar crime unit. I sat in a small, sterile office and calmly laid out the entire story, presenting the evidence for each point. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, listened intently, her expression growing more and more serious as I continued. When I got to the part about the shell company and the inflated contracts, she stopped me. "Mr. Henderson," she said, leaning forward. "Do you understand the severity of what you're alleging?" "I do," I replied. "I'm a structural engineer. I don't make allegations without proof to back them up." I handed her the flash drive. "It's all in there. The corporate filings, the invoices, the canceled checks from the HOA account, and the sworn affidavit from a former board member." She took the drive. "We'll look into this immediately. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Do not engage with Mr. Petrov. Let us handle it from here." I left the DA's office feeling like a massive weight had been lifted. The final phase of my plan, the controlled collapse, was now in the hands of people with badges and subpoena power. Brenda's house of cards was about to come down, and it was going to be a sight to see. Brenda, oblivious to the storm that was gathering, made one last fatal error in judgment. Drunk on her perceived power and enraged by my continued defiance, she decided to stage a public execution. An official notice was sent to every homeowner in Willow Creek. It announced a special emergency meeting of the HOA. The sole agenda item, to discuss the conduct of homeowner Frank Henderson and to vote on sanctions, up to and including the forced sale of his property. It was a ludicrous, legally impossible threat. An HOA has no power to force the sale of a home under these circumstances. But it was pure Brenda, a piece of theater designed to humiliate and crush me in front of the entire community. She intended for this meeting to be her final, triumphant victory. I couldn't have planned it better myself. She was building her own stage, setting her own lighting, and inviting everyone to watch her downfall. I immediately contacted the investigator at the DA's office and told her about the meeting. "This could be the perfect venue," I said. "A room full of her victims." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I agree," the investigator said. "We'll be there. Just act normally. Let her play her hand." The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Brenda had succeeded in creating a spectacle. My allies, George and Carol, gave me quiet, reassuring nods as I entered. I took a seat in the back row and waited. Brenda and the remaining loyal board members sat at the front table, looking solemn and self-important. She banged the gavel, her face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. "This special meeting is now in session," she announced. We are here tonight to address a cancer in our community. A man who has repeatedly shown contempt for our rules, for our standards, and for his neighbors. She then launched into a long, rambling tirade. She painted me as a monster, a litigious troublemaker who had harassed her and the board, who refused to maintain his property, and who was single-handedly destroying the harmonious spirit of Willow Creek. She brought up the lawn, the mailbox, the roses, twisting every detail to make me look like the aggressor. I let her talk. With every lie she told, she was giving the DA's office more ammunition. She was indicting herself with her own words in front of 50 witnesses. When she finally finished, breathless and flushed with her own righteousness, she said, "The board has prepared a motion to find Mr. Henderson in permanent noncompliance and to begin the legal process of placing a lien on his property and forcing a sale to recover unpaid fines and legal fees." "Before you vote on that motion," I said, standing up. My voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a saw. "I believe the community has a right to see the full picture." Brenda's eyes flashed. "You are out of order. You will not speak." "I think he should speak," someone yelled from the crowd. A chorus of agreement followed. The seeds of doubt I had planted at the last meeting had taken root. People were no longer afraid. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a laptop and a small projector. "If you'll just give me 5 minutes," I said to the crowd, ignoring Brenda, "I promise it will be very illuminating." I set up the projector. The first image that flashed on the screen was the certified land survey, the property line clearly marked in red, with the massive sign sitting squarely on my side. "This is my property," I said simply. "The HOA has been trespassing for the last 2 months." Next, I showed the photos of Eleanor's dead roses and the graffiti on my driveway. Gasps rippled through the room. "This is what happens when you question our president," I said. "She doesn't just fine you. She sends her husband to destroy your property in the dead of night." "Lies. That's photoshopped." Brenda screamed, her voice cracking. "Is it?" I asked. I clicked the mouse. The video began to play. The grainy, night vision footage was crystal clear on the big screen. The whole room watched in stunned silence as the president of their HOA and her husband crept onto my property like common thugs, poisoning rose bushes and spray painting my driveway. The silence was broken by a collective gasp. People were turning to look at Brenda, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. "But it's not just about vandalism," I continued, my voice cold and hard. "It's about your money." I projected the $50,000 invoice for the sign from Prestige Monument Solutions, then, next to it, I projected the state incorporation document showing Martin Petrov as the sole owner. Brenda Petrov awarded a $50,000, no-bid contract, paid for with your dues, to her own husband. The room erupted. The spell was broken. The fear was gone, replaced by pure outrage. Brenda completely melted down. She jumped to her feet, her face contorted with rage, and started screaming. It was no longer a coherent speech, just a torrent of accusations and justifications. He deserved it. He's the criminal. I did what I had to do to protect this community. I built this place. That money was mine. It was for my time, my effort. She was confessing. In her blind fury, she was admitting to everything in front of the entire community and, more importantly, the law. Right on cue, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 plainclothes detectives and 2 uniformed officers walked in. The room fell silent. They walked calmly and purposefully through the parting crowd, their eyes locked on the screaming, unraveling woman at the front of the room. One of the detectives, the woman I had met with, approached Brenda. "Brenda Petrov," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and vandalism." Brenda stared at her, her mouth hanging open. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on her. Her reign was over. As the officer cuffed her hands behind her back, her eyes found mine across the room. The fury was gone, replaced by a venomous, chilling hatred. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice a low snarl. "I'll destroy you. I swear it." It was her last, impotent threat. A final puff of smoke from a fire that had been extinguished. I just looked at her, held her gaze, and said nothing. I didn't have to. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut said it all. The aftermath of Brenda's public implosion was swift and decisive. Her husband was arrested at their home later that night. The story became the talk of the town, a cautionary tale of petty tyranny and its spectacular downfall. The community, for its part, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The fear that had hung over Willow Creek for years evaporated overnight. An emergency meeting was called a week later, this time without the tension and drama. A new, interim board was elected. My accountant ally, George, was unanimously voted in as the new treasurer. Carol, the whistleblower, was elected president. Their first act was to declare all of Brenda's vindictive fines and retroactive rule changes null and void. A wave of sanity washed over the neighborhood. The legal process ground on, as it does. Brenda and Martin, faced with an avalanche of undeniable evidence, took a plea bargain. They were convicted of multiple felonies. They had to sell their house to pay for their legal fees and to make restitution to the HOA for the funds they had embezzled. The final tally of their theft was over $200,000, spanning years of doctored invoices and kickbacks. Brenda was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. Martin got 5 years of probation. Her power, her reputation, her home, all of it was gone. She had lost everything. Life in Willow Creek changed for the better. The oppressive atmosphere was replaced by a genuine sense of community. Neighbors started talking to each other again. The draconian rules were systematically reviewed and either revised or removed. The newsletter, once a weapon of shame, became a place for celebrating community events and welcoming new neighbors. I found myself attending the occasional neighborhood barbecue, something I never would have done under the old regime. I was no longer the outcast, I was, to my quiet embarrassment, something of a local hero. People would stop me on my walks to thank me for standing up to her. I would just nod and say that I did what anyone would have done. But I knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have done it. They would have paid the fine, or dug up the roses, or moved away. And I understood why. It's easier not to fight. But I had learned something through all of this. Bullies, whether they're on a playground or on an HOA board, derive their power from the silence of their victims. They count on people choosing the easier path. When you stand up, when you push back with facts and determination, their power crumbles like the cheap brick veneer on a $50,000 sign. It's just a facade. Which brings me back to the sign. After the new board took over, Carol and George came to my house. They formally apologized on behalf of the HOA for the entire ordeal. They offered to have the sign professionally removed and my lawn restored, all at the HOA's expense. I thought about it for a moment, looking at the garish monument of brick and lye sitting on my property. Removing it felt like erasing the evidence, like pretending it never happened. And I didn't want to forget. No, I said. Leave it. They looked surprised. But Frank, Carol said, it's a reminder of all that. I know, I replied. But I have a better idea. As the easement holder, I have the right to access and maintain the utilities and structures within it, correct? George, ever the stickler for rules, consulted the bylaws. That's correct, he confirmed. Good, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. I'd like to perform some maintenance. The following Saturday, I rented a small mobile crane. It wasn't cheap, but it was worth every penny. With the help of the operator, I wrapped heavy-duty straps around the main body of the sign. The whole thing was mounted on 2 thick steel posts, which were bolted into the concrete foundation. A few neighbors came out to watch, curious about what I was doing. I just smiled and waved. Using a massive industrial wrench, I slowly unfastened the 8 large bolts that held the sign to its posts. The crane took the strain, lifting the multi-ton structure a few inches into the air. It hovered there, a symbol of Brenda's arrogance, suspended in midair. Then, I gave the crane operator a simple instruction. Rotate it 180 degrees. He expertly swung the boom around. The sign turned, slowly and majestically, until it was facing the complete opposite direction. We lowered it carefully back onto the posts, and I bolted it back down, tightening the nuts until they would never come loose again. Now, the grand, expensive sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates, Northwest longer faced the road. It faced my backyard. It greeted my trees. Its bold, proud letters were visible only from my kitchen window. It was no longer a symbol of oppression. It was my personal monument to poetic justice. A permanent, immovable reminder that when you stand on solid ground, armed with the truth, you can turn any bully's world completely backward. That afternoon, I went to work in the garden. I carefully dug up Eleanor's dead rose bushes. The poison had done its work, they were beyond saving. But I didn't feel despair. I felt a sense of peace, of closure. I went to the nursery and bought 10 new bushes, the same vibrant, defiant cultivars she had loved. I spent the rest of the day planting them, my hands in the rich soil, the sun on my back. My quiet life had been shattered, but I had rebuilt it on a stronger foundation. And as I looked at my new roses, with Brenda's ridiculous, backward sign standing sentinel behind them, I knew, finally, that Eleanor would have been proud. I was home. And I was at peace.